problem for the public, of course, is this idea that they're spending ever greater sums on council tax. They're having to give over more of their salary than ever to HMRC, and they don't feel they're getting much in return. But to compound matters, we actually have a situation where government waste is a massive, massive problem, not just at national level, but at local level too. Kamal, we're on Waste Watch. The Prime Minister has pledged to tackle Britain's overcautious, flabby state, but he's not committed to cutting our bloated civil service. So is it all a bit of a waste of time?
Well, at least one quango, NHS England, is being scrapped at the cost of 13,000 jobs. But what we actually need is shock therapy, not a polite discussion. In their bones, I really believe not enough Labour politicians really believe in the power of markets, and that is the problem. If you think the state will provide, you will always have a problem with the state being too big.
So as well as crunching the numbers, we'll be speaking to the Telegraph's resident waste watcher, Dia Chakravarty, to find out exactly how the government is squandering your hard-earned taxes.
Well, Camilla, let's start with what was actually a bit of a rabbit out of a hat. A few weeks ago, the head of NHS England suddenly was removed from her post, and everyone thought, oh, that's a bit odd. Maybe it's because Wes Streeting wants to do all these really, really thorough reforms of the NHS. Actually, Keir Starmer and Wes Streeting, the Health Secretary, had a much more radical idea, and that was to get rid of one of the biggest quangos in the UK, which is the organisation that runs the health service in England. Keir Starmer making a speech today. Let's hear what he had to say.
I don't see why decisions about £200 billion of taxpayer money on something as fundamental to our security as the NHS should be taken by an arm's-length body, NHS England. And I can't, in all honesty, explain to the British people why they should spend their money on 2 layers of bureaucracy. That money could and should be spent on nurses, doctors, operation, GP appointments. So today I can announce we're going to cut bureaucracy across the state, focus government on the priorities of working people, shift money to the front line. So I'm bringing management of the NHS back into democratic control by abolishing the arm's-length body NHS England. That will put the NHS back at the heart of government where it belongs, freeing it to focus on patients, less bureaucracy, with more money for nurses, an NHS refocused on cutting waiting times at your hospital.
I mean, that was a bit of a surprise, to be fair. NHS England, set up by the Tories, funnily enough.
Andrew Lansley.
Yeah, back in 2013. That, in turn, could see 13,000 jobs being cut.
Although we need to be careful, because are those jobs simply going to be moved into the myriad of other quangos that are involved in delivering healthcare in the UK? And, yeah, well, 13,000 jobs, it sounds quite a big number, but do you know, Camilla, how many people work for the NHS in the UK?
Altogether?
Altogether.
750,000?
1.5 million people.
It's not even
work
going
for
to
the
touch
NHS.
the sides.
So Keir Starmer was on the road today. He went to a factory, Reckitt Benckiser factory up in Hull, and he literally had his sleeves rolled up, wearing a rather
I hate
a
it
rather
when
dull
politicians do
blue,
this.
rather dull blue shirt. But he said there's going to be rolling up his sleeves and tackling this flabby state. He said Britain was back in the driving seat. I'm
Is it
not quite
really?
sure what that
Was
means.
it ever out of the driving seat?
But he said he made the point, which I think is where the public is that we're paying ever higher taxes. We know that the tax burden is at record rates, but the services we are receiving for those incredibly high taxes are getting worse, not better. And so Keir Starmer, in this speech, has tried to lay out that this government understands government efficiency. But anyone who's watched the arc of this government since the election last summer will know that there is now a complete confusion in the way this Labour government operates. Because in speech after speech, Labour has said it's all about control. Not just the Prime Minister, but also the Chancellor have talked about we're taking back control, we're going to make sure that these things work. And the way they think things should work is by more state, not less state. And that's the big problem that they have.
Yeah, I did find it quite ironic when he said that Britain had turned into a watchdog state. And I sort of thought, to coin the phrase watchdog, you're sort of the Lynn Folds Wood of politicians. You are Mr. Caution, Mr. We must have a review, we must check this, we must appoint a czar. I can't possibly take a decision unless Dame Louise Casey has provided me with a 100-page report on it. So I thought that was a bit ironic. And actually he gave the game away somewhat, Keir Starmer, in the piece he wrote for the Telegraph. Who'd have thunk it? The Prime Minister in our august pages, and it was splashed on the front. Can I just say I don't like the word flabby? Flabby state? Bloated would have been more appropriate. But anyway, there's this killer line in there which I think basically sums up the problem for Keir Starmer. And it is this, quotes, I'm not interested in ideological arguments about whether it should be bigger or smaller. Talking about the state there, should just make that clear. I simply want it to work. Well, no, I'm sorry. You do need to mount an ideological argument about how big the state should be. You hit me with a killer stat. Do you know how many full-time civil servants we employ in Britain today, Kamal?
I'm going to say 600,000.
515,000 at the last count. But crucially, that is up significantly over the last 5 to 10 years. So we had this kind of sweet spot. Admittedly, it was post Osborne and Cameron's austerity, where we went down to 384,000 civil servants in 2016. And when I saw that stat, and then I now see that the numbers are over 500,000, admittedly bloated by both Brexit and COVID, I look at it and think, well, does the country run any better now? We've got that many more people in the civil service than it ran in 2016.
There's another incredible stat. You know how much I do love a number. If you look at productivity, which is how much output does the economy produce every hour. So productivity in the private sector between 1990 and 2022 went up by 27%.
Yay, capitalism.
Woo! Public sector productivity in the same period went down by 8%. So
boo, socialism.
No, not socialism. I mean, as we said, NHS England was set up by Andrew Lansley, a Conservative health secretary. What we did have in the period of David Cameron and George Osborne, I really dislike the word austerity.
Yes.
It's become a word that is weaponized against what I would call efficiency.
Yes, one man's austerity is another's efficiency. Keir Starmer's asked today, by the way, isn't this austerity? Oh, no, it isn't. It's something different because I'm doing it.
But as you say, it is an ideological argument. Margaret Thatcher made the ideological argument correctly based on her understanding of, great economists like Milton Friedman, great political philosophers like Friedrich Hayek, who made it absolutely clear the way that economies function, create wealth, and therefore create the tax revenue we need to run brilliant hospitals, to run brilliant schools, to pay for defence. That's how you pay for it. The smaller the state and the more market that you have, given those productivity figures, the better it is for the public services themselves. This is the connection, the ideological connection that so many people on the left don't understand. And we've said today, and let's say half a cheer that one quango has gone. But since the government won the election, or since the Labour Party won the election last summer, they have actually put in place, I'm just looking at the list here, 27 new quangos. Can I just read out at least a few of them? Here are some of the things that the government has put in place since it won the election. And this is a government supposedly that's all about efficiency and getting rules out of the way. We have a new regulatory innovation office. So
useful,
that's actually
really
a new regulator to regulate the regulators to make sure they're pro-growth. We have a National Infrastructure and Service Transformation Authority. We have Great British Energy, Mission Control, which I think is about space, I'm assuming, the National Energy System Operator, the Solar Task Force, Border Security Command, Jet Zero Task Force, the British Infrastructure Task Force, another infrastructure task force, the Circular Economy Task Force, the Tree Planting Task Force.
Now you can have a couple of royals in that one.
The Child Poverty Task Force, the Flooding Resilience Task Force, the
Tell the people of Boscombe that exists.
The Motor Insurance Task Force, the New Towns Task Force,
the New Towns Task Force.
Onshore, I'm sure there's one for Ed Miliband, the Onshore Wind Industry Task Force, Skills England, the Industrial Strategy Council, the Passenger Standards Authority, the National Jobs and Careers Task Force, the Ethics and Integrity Commissioner, House of Commons Modernisation Committee. That's that building work. Well, that's never going to happen in our lifetime.
It's really old, that building, so you should have a quango to think about how it could be more modern.
So you need a quango for that. You need the School Support Staff Negotiating Body, the Independent Football Regulator. Why that is involved in the Premier League, who knows? The Fair Work Agency and the Defence Innovation Agency. So 27 at the moment. Quangos versus non-quangos are 27-1 ahead.
Wow. It just sounds to me like money for old rope for anyone working in any of these organisations, with the greatest respect. And do you know what? We saw how damaging this contracting out of governmental responsibility can be during COVID. It was this lack of a command and control structure, the idea that the buck could just be passed between all of these arm's length bodies, PHE, NHS England, it's not our fault, the Department of Health has got their hands off, the CQC as well, the Care Quality Commission, that kept on pumping out endless amounts of paperwork, particularly to care homes, as they are literally grappling with deaths on the front line. It's completely preposterous, but yet successive governments have unfortunately failed on this. Remember David Cameron promising that bonfire of quangos? I mean, I don't know, maybe he lit a scented candle somewhere in Whitehall, but there certainly
from his shepherd's hut.
Yeah, from his shepherd's hut, probably crafted by his wife Samantha, but there was certainly no bonfire. And this is the other thing, to be fair. When I asked Pat McFadden, the Cabinet Office Minister driving these proposals forward, how many civil servants are you actually going to cut? Can't give me a number. I said, OK, well, government sources suggest that it might be 10,000. No, I can't possibly confirm that. And then the attack line from Labour, which probably is justified, is to say, oh, well, the Tories let the numbers spiral out of control, which, by the way, isn't untrue. So back in 2022, we get Boris Johnson's government pledging to cut civil service numbers by 91,000. I think probably fueled by Dominic Cummings, who had constantly made this point about how badly our state was run, basically, how inefficiently. He'll probably quite like Keir Starmer's AI ideas, by the way. And in the end, they scrapped that figure altogether. Then Jeremy Hunt came in and said, we need a cap on civil service numbers. Didn't actually put it on. And actually, in the last swathes of the last Tory government, the numbers swelled from the late 400,000s to about 520,000. So they actually went up, even though the Tories had pledged to bring them down. It's
amazing.
I mean, that is just a sign of why people get so frustrated.
There's a momentum in the civil service which can't be stopped, whatever politicians say, because civil servants are often in the civil service for their whole careers. And politicians are in one day, out the next. And so civil servants know all they need is patience. Then they can just continue. But Philip Johnston, our brilliant columnist, he wrote a very, very interesting piece ahead of Keir Starmer's announcements today, saying that it is easy to blame the civil servants, but politicians come in, they constantly announce new policies that they want to happen, taking back control. They set up all these different quangos. They then give the civil service contradictory things that they're supposed to do, because within government there is a split. If you think about people like Pat McFadden, who is actually, I think, one of the genuine reformers in the cabinet. I think Wes Streeting is a genuine reformer. Getting rid of such a huge NHS quango is a move that will be disliked by the unions and some people within the NHS. I think Rachel Reeves has some instincts towards more market-orientated policies because she needs to create growth in the UK. But on the other side of the fence, you will have Bridget Phillipson, you will have more left-wing cabinet members, and they are then loading onto the civil service. I want the government to achieve all these things, and the civil servants are left there struggling to think, well, how are all these things supposed to actually work together? And Philip Johnston, in his piece, was saying, we have to agree as a country that we want fewer policies, and at times we will have to sort out our own things as individuals. And that's back to, it is an ideological battle, and that is what the ideological battle that Thatcher won in the late 70s and into the 80s, which should be returned to the UK.
Yeah, and to be fair, that is what Kemi Badenoch was advocating in this very studio when she talked about a smaller state doing less, but doing those things well, than a bigger state trying to do a lot very badly. I just like this reference to Yes Minister in Phil's piece, because he quotes Sir Humphrey Appleby, of course, the Sir Humphrey figure who is constantly trying to thwart the Minister, Jim Hacker's attempts to squeeze the civil service. Sir Humphrey, in that brilliant series, gives the view from Whitehall. I have served 11 governments in the past 30 years. If I had believed in all their policies, I would have been passionately committed to keeping out of the common market and passionately committed to going into it. I would have been utterly convinced of the rightness of nationalising steel and of denationalising it and renationalising it. On capital punishment, I'd have been a fervent retentionist and an ardent abolitionist. I would have been a Keynesian and a Friedmanite, a grammar school preserver and destroyer. But above all, I would have been a stark, staring, raving schizophrenic.
Absolutely. And I think there is sympathy there for the officials trying to do their master and mistress's bidding. In the piece as well, this goes back decades. He talks about Harold Wilson, the Prime Minister in the 1960s, setting up the Fulton Committee because he said that officials were blocking the reforms that this new Labour government wanted to put in place. And at that stage, and this is where the civil service, I think, can be criticised, because do they actually have the skills to run a 21st century economy? The Oxford Don that he put in charge of that committee, Thomas Balogh, he said the civil service encouraged a purposefully useless, somewhat dilettante erudition. So they just endlessly turn the wheels on discussing the issue rather than getting to the solution. Let's just touch on the AI thing, Camilla, that has been a big part of this. The idea that if we could really understand how artificial intelligence can make us more efficient. And I thought here, Peter Kyle, the Science and Innovation Minister, he made a reasonable point. He was on GB News this morning.
We've discovered that almost half of all transactions undertaken by government are analogue. That means 45,000 envelopes opened at DVLA. It means 100,000 phone calls being answered by HMRC. And someone in my office in government, a civil servant who fantastically got pregnant recently and had a baby, her maternity card was sent through the post. She had to fill it out by hand. She had to go through with all the checkups, having it filled in manually, and she was told that if she didn't have that card with her when she went into labour and went into hospital to give birth, then they wouldn't have access to her medical records. This is no way to do government. It is no way to do government into the 2020s going forward, and we are going to fix that by delivering a more efficient and effective civil service and systems in government, and a much better service to people up and down our country.
He said that many civil servants are still involved in very 20th century things like literally stuffing envelopes and getting them to be delivered, that they send hundreds of thousands of letters still every single year, and that, for example, if you've had a baby, you still get a cardboard maternity card which you have to fill out and then carry around with you when you're getting your maternity services. And he said that he had gone to the DVLA, who look after our licenses, and asked the pretty basic question, why aren't our driving licenses on our phones? And why can't we do that? And he said he was told that would take 5 years to do. Camilla, we must make sure we put a pin in this promise and come back to this. He said in 11 months, we will now get smartphone driving licenses. instead of the plastic ones that have to be sent through the post, etc., etc. So let's do a little test, Camilla. Right back to the 1960s and Harold Wilson, politicians have endlessly said we need to be more efficient, the civil service needs to be better. As you say, Dominic Cummings revealed his intense irritation at the lack of delivery of the civil service. Let's do the Peter Kyle test. OK, Peter, you said 11 months.
Yep.
We'll keep an eye on it.
I'm making a diary note now.
Excellent.
And the problem for the public, of course, is this idea that they're spending ever greater sums on council tax. They're having to give over more of their salary than ever to HMRC, and they don't feel they're getting much in return. But to compound matters, we actually have a situation where government waste is a massive, massive problem, not just at national level, but at local level too. Dia Chakravarty, who we are calling the Telegraph's resident waste watcher.
That's me.
That's her.
Very clever. I love that. Love that little clever idea there. Camilla. Well done.
You have been doing for quite some months, and there are imitations of this, but we started it. You started watching just how much of our hard-earned taxes were being wasted by government, both on a national and local level. So first of all, let's just start by asking for your reaction to Keir Starmer rolling up his sleeves.
He is. We both got our sleeves rolled up today.
He is going to be the driving force in bringing down waste, isn't he, dear? Do we believe him?
I want to. Let's give him a try. I mean, we have waited for a long time when we had politicians who were used to talking the right talk. We didn't get very much done. So maybe an outsider who has previously, as far as I know, hadn't made this his mission to cut waste and deliver efficiency for taxpayers, maybe an outsider will now come and do it. I just thought I'd talk a little bit about just a line or two about what was positive in there. Accountability was a good word that I heard a few times. So this idea about quangos, or semi-autonomous bodies, which are independent from the government, but they're taxpayer funded, but nobody seems to take responsibility for what they do or do not deliver. It seems like Keir Starmer is very determined to bring responsibility back to our elected officials, which is as it should be, because when they then commit a mistake or do something negligently or even maliciously wrong, we can get rid of them. When it's a faceless technocrat, a faceless bureaucrat, there's no way for us to hold them responsible. So that's a good thing that I heard Keir Starmer talking about. The trouble is, we've heard this talk before.
Yes.
Doesn't he need actually to take a proper bonfire to how government and local government actually operates?
Absolutely. And when he said we are definitely not for austerity, but we are going to tighten our belts anyway, I don't know what that means. And let's think about where the opposition is going to come from. We've already heard unions making some noises because they will want to protect the interest of their members. When we talk about job cuts, when we talk about greater accountability in the civil service, say, for example, performance-related pay, etc., there's a huge amount of pushback that Sir Keir is going to face from his own support base, if you like, his own donors, if you like. It'll be very interesting to see how he combats that.
Dia, as you've gone through the different waste files that you've accumulated, give us some idea of the worst examples of wastes of taxpayers' money.
Right. I'd quite like to do this, not necessarily in terms of the sheer amount of money spent, but the injustice, I suppose, of how it is being spent, the utter insanity of it. So one of my favourite examples is the Senedd in Wales spending millions of taxpayers' money on international relations. Now, this is an example that I would like to say illustrates taxpayers' money being spent where it absolutely, categorically does not need to be spent. What are they doing? They have 12 international offices across the world where Senedd members go and talk about what an inclusive country or a nation within a country Wales is. And this sort of stuff all the while happening while the Welsh ambulance service is declaring an emergency, where service cuts are being experienced by taxpayers every single time they come into contact with public service. It just doesn't make any sense at all. It is nothing but virtue signalling.
What other examples at a national level? So you've got the Welsh Parliament, as you say, the Senedd.
Yes.
What other national examples have you got? And often it is local examples that are most egregious as well. I know you've done some of those as well.
Yes, let's talk about the national one first. HS2 is one of my favourite examples because that is a huge amount of money involved there, £90 billion. What really annoys me about this is that almost a decade ago, people like the Taxpayers Alliance, people like the Institute for Economic Affairs were saying that this is the sort of money it's going to end up costing taxpayers, but they were being dismissed as cranks, as sort of people in the fringes who don't know what they're talking about. But ultimately, that is where we are. We will have already acquired a lot of land to build train tracks that HS2 was going to use. To decommission that now, because the project isn't going ahead, we have to spend even more taxpayers' money to make sure that we leave it in a safer, in a safe enough situation.
Also, there was a silly story last week, but it did catch my eye, that HS2 had spent about 20 grand on Lego models of what it might look like. And you're like, is it just a bottomless pit for spending our cash?
The famous £100 million bat tunnel. I think the HS2 is one of those projects where we have revealed our inability to build things, and a lot of that is down to too much regulation.
Birmingham Council spent £108 million replacing one computer system with another, which was 5 times the sum initially predicted and delivered 5 years later than initially planned.
Very much so. And I think, if I remember correctly, Camilla, all of this was happening while they were declaring £135 million worth of service cuts. So, there's the opportunity cost point there as well. Where money's being taken away from taxpayers, which is meant to provide some essential services, roadworks, ambulance services, whatever, and being spent on this sort of stuff. The Birmingham Council is a good example for another reason. The people who were involved in overseeing all of this, the bankruptcy, the completely ridiculous over budget, over time spending of that project, the councillors are still in place. And
Yes,
this is a good example.
No heads have rolled.
No heads have rolled. And this is what we keep seeing over and over again. Another very small example is a small amount of money. It was about £4,000 being paid to an ambulance worker in compensation because the London Ambulance Services decided that he was saying something which was offensive, which wasn't in line with their DEI regulations. And if I remember correctly, what he had said was, this service, London's Ambulance Service, cannot be a racist organisation because all people of all ethnic hues work in this service. And that was deemed to be offensive enough. So he was suspended on full pay. The case was looked into. He was sent on taxpayer-funded allyship, training, etc. And he successfully sued his former employer. I don't know whether he went back to work after that, and was awarded about £4,000. That's an example for me where the state has no business getting involved whatsoever. That's almost thought policing.
Well, Dia, thank you very much indeed for joining us on the
Thank
Daily
you for
Tea.
having
And
me.
we will continue to read with interest your waste files.
Thank you.